In the small town of Palm Springs, Florida, Pastor Jonathan Brooks had built a reputation for being a compassionate, wise, and highly respected leader in the community. His church was a sanctuary for those in need, offering a space where people could gather to find solace and guidance. The building, though modest, was a symbol of hope for the townspeople, a place where they could connect with their faith and, for many, a sense of purpose. Pastor Brooks had devoted his life to serving others, dedicating every sermon, every moment of his time to lifting the spirits of his congregation. He was a man of deep faith, and his commitment to God and his community was unwavering. Among the regular attendees at the church was Ember Reeves, a young woman in her late 20s who had recently moved to the town. She had grown up in a troubled household, and her past was marked by mistakes and heartache. Despite her hardships, Ember was determined to start fresh. She sought solace in the church, hoping it would help her rebuild her life. She was drawn to the sense of peace that Pastor Brooks emanated. His calming presence seemed to soothe her troubled mind, and his words offered clarity in the chaos of her thoughts. Over the weeks that followed, Ember began to attend church more frequently, often arriving early to sit in the pews alone, contemplating her life. She would listen intently to Pastor Brooks's sermons, hanging on every word as though his teachings were the only thing that made sense in her tumultuous world. She found herself staying after the services, quietly speaking with him about the difficulties she was facing, seeking his advice on how to move forward. Pastor Brooks, being the kind and understanding man that he was, always took the time to listen, offering gentle counsel and encouragement. But as time passed, Ember began to develop feelings for the pastor that went beyond mere admiration. She found herself thinking about him constantly, daydreaming about what it would be like to be in his presence outside the confines of the church. She started to see him not just as a spiritual guide, but as something more, someone who could fill the emptiness in her life. She wanted to be close to him, to be more than just a parishioner in his congregation. Her thoughts grew increasingly focused on him, and her actions began to reflect her growing obsession. Pastor Brooks, however, was well aware of the line that existed between spiritual guidance and personal boundaries. He had been in this position before with other members of his congregation and knew the importance of maintaining a professional distance. He had devoted his life to his faith, and while he genuinely cared for the well-being of his parishioners, he knew that his role was to guide them spiritually, not to become personally involved with them. He had seen the dangers of blurred lines in the past, and he was determined not to fall into that trap. One day, Ember approached Pastor Brooks after the service, her face flushed with an intensity he had never seen before. She spoke with urgency, her words a little too quick, a little too eager. She confided in him about the difficulties she was facing, but as she spoke, Pastor Brooks could feel an undercurrent of something more in her words. She seemed almost desperate for his approval, for something more than just advice. There was a look in her eyes that made him uncomfortable, a longing that he couldn't ignore. Pastor Brooks, ever the professional, listened patiently, offering his usual words of comfort. But he couldn't help but feel a shift in the air, a subtle tension that had not been there before. He knew that Ember was struggling, but there was something more to her behavior, something that was slowly beginning to feel more like a plea for something she wasn't ready to admit. The next few weeks were marked by increasingly frequent encounters between Ember and Pastor Brooks. She would find excuses to linger after services, always seeking out his company. She would ask him to stay a little longer to talk, sometimes about personal matters, sometimes just about life in general. The meetings always seemed harmless, but Pastor Brooks began to sense that there was a growing emotional attachment on Ember's part that went beyond what he could offer as a pastor. He started to feel uneasy in her presence, a feeling he couldn't shake. Despite his discomfort, Pastor Brooks continued to offer his support, never fully confronting Ember about the nature of her feelings. He didn't want to make her feel rejected or judged, but he also knew that he had to be firm in setting boundaries. He began to direct her to other members of the church, encouraging her to seek guidance from the women's group that met regularly. He hoped that by doing so, she would find the support she needed without becoming too dependent on him. But Ember's obsession continued to grow. She began to attend church more frequently than ever, sometimes coming in the middle of the week just to sit alone in the pews. It was as if the church had become the only place where she could feel truly connected to something or someone. The lines between her spiritual life and her personal desires were beginning to blur, and she found herself unable to stop thinking about the pastor. Pastor Brooks, though deeply empathetic, knew that he had to distance himself from Ember, and he began to avoid her more deliberately. He focused on his ministry, throwing himself into his work in an attempt to keep his mind occupied. He prayed for wisdom, asking God to give him the strength to handle the situation with grace and compassion. His faith had always been his anchor, and in times of difficulty, he leaned into it more than ever, trusting that God would guide him through this trial. But Ember's persistence only grew stronger. One evening, as Pastor Brooks prepared to leave the church after a long day, he noticed Ember sitting alone in one of the back pews. Her eyes followed him as he moved around the church, and there was a look in her gaze that made him stop in his tracks. She seemed almost pleading, her expression a mixture of longing and desperation. It was in that moment that Pastor Brooks realized just how serious the situation had become. He knew that he needed to address it head-on before things escalated any further. But as he approached her, he found himself at a loss for words. How could he help her without rejecting her entirely? How could he remain true to his calling as a pastor without violating the very principles he had devoted his life to? The tension in the church was palpable as he stood there, unsure of what to say or do. He prayed silently for guidance, hoping that the right words would come to him. The quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that filled the room, as the weight of the moment pressed down on both of them. It was clear that something had to change, but what? Ember's feelings, for Pastor Brooks, had always been complicated. At first, she had sought him out for guidance, a steady presence in her tumultuous life. The church was the one place where she could find a sense of peace, and it was Pastor Brooks who had given her the strength to keep going. His sermons were filled with wisdom, his words always resonating with her, helping her navigate the difficult emotions that often clouded her thoughts. There was something about his voice, the way he spoke with such conviction, that made her feel understood in a way no one else ever had. But as the days passed and Ember attended church more regularly, something began to shift within her. She had always admired Pastor Brooks, but now that admiration grew into something deeper, something more intense. The gentle compassion he showed towards her, the way he listened attentively when she poured her heart out to him, began to awaken feelings that she hadn't anticipated. She couldn't help but notice the way he carried himself, his calm demeanor, his thoughtful eyes, the warmth of his smile. There was an undeniable pull between them, something that felt both comforting and dangerous at the same time. She tried to ignore it, telling herself that her feelings were nothing more than a passing infatuation, that they would fade with time. But they didn't. Ember started to crave his presence. She began to attend services with more frequency, always finding excuses to stay after the sermon, to sit in the pews and wait for him to finish his duties. It wasn't that she needed more spiritual guidance. In fact, she had heard everything he had to say. But there was something about being near him, hearing his voice, that calmed the storm inside her. She would sit quietly, watching him interact with other members of the congregation, feeling a knot tighten in her chest as she wished that one day he might look at her the way he looked at others. She tried to convince herself that her feelings were harmless, that it was just admiration for a man of God, someone who had become a pillar in her life. But the more she thought about him, the more she wanted to be near him, the more the line between respect and desire blurred. She began to fantasize about what it would be like to be with him, not just as a member of his congregation, but as something more. She wanted to share her life with him, to be the one he turned to when things got difficult. She imagined what it would feel like to hold his hand, to sit beside him in silence, just the two of them, sharing an unspoken connection that no one else could understand. These thoughts consumed her, and with each passing day they grew stronger. She began to feel a sense of urgency, a belief that she couldn't wait any longer. She had to make him notice her, had to make him see that there was more between them than just a pastor and a parishioner. She started dressing differently, hoping that he would take notice of her appearance. She paid more attention to how she spoke to him, hoping that her words would somehow convey the depth of her feelings. She wanted him to understand that she wasn't just another face in the crowd, that she was someone special, someone who could offer him something he might not even know he needed. But Pastor Brooks, as much as he cared for Ember, was always careful to maintain a professional distance. He saw the way she looked at him, the way her eyes lingered a little too long, but he refused to acknowledge it. He had dedicated his life to his faith, and he knew the importance of setting boundaries. He had been trained to offer counsel and support to his parishioners, but not to become personally involved with them. He could sense that Ember was struggling, but he also understood that her feelings were likely a product of the emotional turmoil she had experienced in her past. She had come to the church looking for answers, and Pastor Brooks had always been there to guide her. But he knew that his role was to help her heal spiritually, not to be the object of her desires. Still, he couldn't deny the subtle shift in their interactions. There were moments when Ember's presence felt different, charged with an energy that made him uneasy. He had always been able to connect with his congregation, but there was something about her that made him feel uncomfortable, as though she was holding on to something he wasn't prepared to give. He tried to redirect her focus, encouraging her to join other groups within the church, to seek counsel from the women's ministry, hoping that they could provide her with the support she needed. He knew that he had to remain distant, but the more he tried to push her away, the more she seemed to draw closer. Ember was persistent. She would often find ways to keep the conversation going, asking him questions about his sermons, about his life, even when she knew he was busy. She would come to the church during the week when it was quiet, hoping to catch him alone. It wasn't that she wanted to disrupt his work, but she couldn't help herself. Every time they spoke, it felt like the connection between them deepened, and she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to their relationship than he was willing to admit. The more time Ember spent with Pastor Brooks, the more her feelings grew. She couldn't understand why he wasn't responding to her the way she had hoped. Why wasn't he seeing the same things she saw? Why couldn't he feel the chemistry that seemed so undeniable to her? She began to feel a sense of frustration building within her, a belief that maybe she had been mistaken in thinking that he cared for her the way she cared for him. The more she pushed for his attention, the more he withdrew, and it only made her feelings stronger. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day, Ember found herself standing in front of Pastor Brooks's office, her heart racing with anticipation. She knew he would be there, finishing up his work before heading home. She had no plan, no particular reason for being there, but the desire to be near him was overpowering. She needed to see him, needed to feel his presence, just one more time. She knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. As she stepped inside, her eyes locked onto his. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing there. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the way he tensed, almost as if he was unsure of how to handle her sudden appearance. She forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside her, but it was hard to pretend that everything was normal. For a brief moment, she wondered if this was it, that he would finally see her, finally understand what she had been feeling all along. But as he began to speak to her, his words calm and professional, she realized that he wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to see her the way she wanted him to. And it was in that moment that Ember felt a shift inside her, a sense of loss and confusion that would only deepen as she struggled to come to terms with her feelings. Her obsession with Pastor Brooks had taken root, and now there was no turning back. Ember's confusion and frustration grew as the days passed. She had spent so much time fantasizing about Pastor Brooks, imagining what it would be like to be with him, to have him acknowledge her feelings. But the more she tried to get closer to him, the more he pulled away. She could sense the walls he had built around himself, his refusal to let her cross the line from parishioner to something more. She tried to push through the boundaries he had set, convinced that he was simply being cautious, that deep down, he felt the same way she did. But the more she attempted to bridge the gap, the more he distanced himself. It wasn't that Pastor Brooks was cold or dismissive. He was always polite, always respectful, but there was an emotional barrier that Ember could not seem to break. She had spent countless hours imagining different scenarios, playing out her fantasies in her head. She had convinced herself that one day, he would look at her the way she wanted him to, that he would realize she was the one who truly understood him. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the connection she had been yearning for was never going to happen. One night after a particularly tense service, Ember's emotions overwhelmed her. The way Pastor Brooks had avoided eye contact with her during the sermon, the way he had turned his attention to other members of the congregation, left her feeling rejected, invisible. She had spent so long trying to get his attention, but it was clear that nothing she did was going to make him see her the way she wanted. The realization hit her hard, like a physical blow, and she couldn't suppress the overwhelming feelings of hurt and anger that swelled up inside her. In that moment of anger, a dark thought took root in her mind. What if she could make him see her, make him notice her in a way that he couldn't ignore? What if she could force his attention, make him acknowledge her in a way that would leave no room for doubt? Ember's mind began to race, her thoughts becoming more erratic with each passing moment. She knew what she had to do. The next day, Ember made her decision. She would accuse Pastor Brooks of something so serious, so undeniable, that he would have no choice but to focus on her. She would make him see her, even if it meant destroying his life. The thought of her own desperation, the way she had been chasing him for so long, suddenly felt overwhelming. She had been so caught up in her fantasies that she hadn't stopped to consider the consequences of her actions. But now, in this moment of clarity, all she could think about was taking control of the situation. She needed him to pay attention to her, and if this was the only way to get him to do that, then she would do it. Ember spent the entire day preparing herself, her emotions in turmoil. She rehearsed the words in her mind, trying to figure out the best way to make her accusation sound believable. She knew that the more convincing she was, the more likely it would be that people would take her seriously. She had watched enough television shows and read enough news stories to know how these things worked. The accusations would be made. The investigation would begin, and there would be no turning back. She arrived at the church late that evening, just as the last few members of the congregation were leaving. Pastor Brooks was in his office finishing up some paperwork. Ember took a deep breath before knocking on the door, entering without waiting for an invitation. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and she stood in the middle of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Pastor Brooks looked up from his desk, surprised to see her there. He smiled politely, but there was something in his expression that Ember couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the tension in his posture, or the way his eyes darted to the door, as if he was already anticipating what might happen next. Ember tried to steady her breath, her hands trembling slightly as she took a step forward. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. "It's about something that happened the other night. Something that I can't keep to myself anymore." Pastor Brooks looked at her with concern, sensing the gravity in her tone. He motioned for her to sit, but Ember refused. She needed to make sure that he would listen, that he would pay attention to her. She stood her ground, her hands clenched at her sides as she spoke. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "But something happened between us. I don't know what you were thinking, but I can't pretend like nothing happened. You hurt me." Pastor Brooks was stunned. He opened his mouth to speak, but Ember quickly cut him off. "You took advantage of me," she said, her voice growing stronger, more resolute. "I trusted you, and you used that trust against me. You made me believe that you cared, that there was something between us, but it was all a lie. You assaulted me, and I can't let you get away with it." The words spilled out of her in a rush, each one falling from her lips like a weight she had been carrying for far too long. She watched as Pastor Brooks's face went pale, his eyes widening in shock. He tried to speak, but she didn't let him. "You don't get to do this to me," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't get to take what's mine, to use your power over me. I'm telling everyone what you did, and I'm going to make sure that they believe me." Pastor Brooks opened his mouth again, his voice barely a whisper. "Ember, please." But Ember wasn't listening anymore. She had made her decision, and there was no going back. She turned on her heel and walked out of the office, leaving Pastor Brooks standing there, frozen in disbelief. As she walked down the darkened hallway of the church, her heart pounded in her chest. She felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She had done it. She had taken control. Now, all she had to do was wait for the truth to come out, for people to see what had really happened. But as she walked out of the church and into the night, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. The rush of power, the sense of victory, was slowly beginning to fade, and in its place, doubt began to creep in. Was this really the answer she had been searching for? Had she truly been wronged, or had she just allowed her emotions to get the better of her? The storm inside her mind raged on, but there was no turning back. The accusation had been made, and the course of events had already begun to take shape. She could only wait now to see how everything would unfold. The days following Ember's accusation were filled with tension, not only for Pastor Brooks but for everyone involved. The weight of the claim hung heavy in the air, clouding everything around it. Pastor Brooks had tried to clear his mind, focusing on his faith and the strength he drew from prayer, but the reality of the situation was inescapable. The community, usually a place of peace and spiritual reflection, was now divided. People whispered in hushed tones, eyes following Pastor Brooks wherever he went, some with pity, others with suspicion. Ember, too, had felt the sting of her decision. What had started as an attempt to gain the attention she craved had now spiraled into something far more complicated. She tried to suppress the growing guilt that gnawed at her, the idea that something had gone wrong, that the consequences of her actions might destroy more than just Pastor Brooks, kept her up at night. Yet, she had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. The church's leadership had been forced to take the matter seriously, and soon the entire church would be drawn into a mess of legalities and investigations. The truth, whatever it was, would come to light in the courtroom. But just as things seemed to be spiraling further out of control, an unexpected development would alter the course of the investigation. It came in the form of an old security camera, something that no one had thought to check before, something that could have changed everything from the very beginning. The church had installed surveillance cameras years ago as a means of protecting the property. They had always been meant for security, footage of the parking lot, the outside of the building, and a few key rooms inside the church, but no one had ever considered that they might hold the key to clearing up the whole mess. Pastor Brooks had no idea that such a camera was positioned directly in the hallway outside his office, providing a clear view of the interactions between him and Ember on the night of her accusation. The footage was discovered by accident when one of the church staff members was reviewing some old tapes in an unrelated matter. The security camera, which had been dormant and overlooked for months, had been storing footage without anyone paying much attention to it. The staff member, a quiet, detail-oriented man named Derek, noticed something strange while scanning through the files. He had stumbled upon footage from the night Ember had come to Pastor Brooks's office. It wasn't long before he realized the significance of what he had found. Derek, not one to act hastily, decided to inform Pastor Brooks immediately. He could hardly believe what he was seeing himself. The footage revealed Ember's entire interaction with Pastor Brooks, showing that what she had accused him of was far from the truth. The camera captured her entering his office and standing before him, speaking with a visible intensity. The video, however, painted a very different picture of what transpired inside that office. As the footage rolled, it was clear that Ember was the one initiating the interaction. She had entered the office without any invitation, her body language demanding attention. Pastor Brooks, to his credit, had remained composed. He did not react with anger or surprise. Instead, he was calm, attempting to reason with Ember as she stood there, her posture defensive, her emotions raw. At no point did he physically approach her, nor did he exhibit any of the behavior that Ember had accused him of. In fact, the video clearly showed that he had maintained a respectful distance, never crossing the line. The tension in the room was palpable as Ember spoke, her words filled with emotion, but there was no sign of any violent or inappropriate behavior from Pastor Brooks. On the contrary, the footage showed that he tried to calm her, speaking softly, but Ember had appeared unable to hear him. She was intent on pushing her narrative, and the video footage made it obvious that the story she had told was a fabrication. Her actions seemed driven by something other than a genuine accusation. They were motivated by frustration, by a need for validation that she had not been able to find in the pastor's rejection. Derek knew this could be the breakthrough Pastor Brooks needed, but he also understood the delicate nature of what he had discovered. He had to be careful. The church had been thrown into a state of unrest, and one misstep could ruin everything. Derek was well aware that the reputation of the church, the pastor, and the entire congregation were at stake. He approached Pastor Brooks quietly, asking for a moment to speak. The pastor, already weary from the constant stress and scrutiny, nodded and listened intently as Derek explained the situation. When Derek showed him the footage, Pastor Brooks's face, previously strained, softened. He had been praying for deliverance, for a way to prove his innocence, and now, perhaps, God had provided a sign. Pastor Brooks knew that this footage, this unaltered evidence, could clear his name. But how to handle it, how to use it without causing further damage to the fragile community. He could not just walk into the church and demand that people believe the truth. He needed to think carefully about how to approach the matter. The accusation against him had already been made, and the community's perception had already shifted. For many, the damage was done. His reputation, once pristine, was now in question. To reveal the footage too soon might only make things worse. The decision was made to go through the proper legal channels. Pastor Brooks, with the support of his lawyer, Michael Carter, arranged for the footage to be submitted as evidence in the ongoing investigation. It wasn't long before the authorities had seen the tape, and it quickly became clear that Ember's version of the story had no basis in reality. There was no assault, no inappropriate behavior. The investigation, which had been moving in a direction of growing suspicion toward the pastor, now turned to Ember's accusations. The truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, and it was beginning to unravel the case against Pastor Brooks. But the discovery of the footage did not end things immediately. The legal process was slow, and there was still the matter of clearing Pastor Brooks's name in the public eye. The church community was divided, and the members of the congregation who had once looked up to him as a spiritual guide now questioned his integrity. The church board had to make decisions about his future, and some of the parishioners who had believed Ember's accusation without question began to change their tune as the evidence mounted. Some still held on to their doubts, unsure of what to believe, while others rallied behind Pastor Brooks, knowing that he was a man of integrity. As the investigation continued, Ember's emotions shifted once again. The guilt that had been buried beneath the surface began to bubble up, and she started to question everything she had done. The power she had once felt from her accusation now felt hollow. The people who had once supported her were now turning their backs. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. She had accused a man of something unforgivable, and now the truth was being laid bare for everyone to see. The moment of reckoning was coming, and Ember couldn't escape it. For Pastor Brooks, the discovery of the footage was a moment of hope, but he knew that the road ahead would be long. Clearing his name in the eyes of the law was one thing, but healing the rift within his congregation was another. He continued to pray, hoping that the truth would not only set him free but also bring peace to the wounded community that had been torn apart by lies. The courtroom was filled with tension as the case against Pastor Jonathan Brooks progressed to the next phase. What had started as a personal and private accusation was now a public spectacle. The church community had been following the case, with bated breath, some holding out hope that the truth would come to light while others were still uncertain of what to believe. Ember's accusation, which had shaken the very foundation of the congregation, was now on trial, and so was the reputation of a man they had once looked up to as a spiritual guide. The morning of the trial was gray and overcast, a reflection of the somber mood that hung over the courthouse. Pastor Brooks arrived with his lawyer, Michael Carter, by his side, his expression calm, though the weight of the situation was evident. He had spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength and guidance. It had been a difficult few weeks filled with public scrutiny and private reflection. The truth, he hoped, would eventually come out, but even he knew that no matter the outcome, this experience would forever alter his life and his ministry. The prosecution was prepared to present Ember's version of the events. They had already painted Pastor Brooks as a predator in the court of public opinion, relying heavily on her emotional testimony. Ember was the star witness, and her credibility would be scrutinized. The defense, on the other hand, was relying on the evidence from the hidden security camera, which had already begun to turn the tide in Pastor Brooks's favor. The footage, clear and unaltered, showed Ember entering the pastor's office and speaking with him, but it revealed nothing that could substantiate her claims. It was a quiet but powerful piece of evidence, proof that Pastor Brooks had not engaged in the behavior Ember had accused him of. As the trial began, the judge, Karen Mitchell, called the court to order, her gavel echoing through the room. The jury sat quietly, their eyes shifting between the two sides as they listened to the opening statements. The prosecution was focused on Ember's emotional distress, painting her as a victim who had been taken advantage of by someone in a position of power and trust. The defense, however, wasted no time in introducing the key piece of evidence, the security footage. Michael Carter, Pastor Brooks's attorney, stood confidently as he presented the video, playing it for the court. The footage was clear, with every movement captured in high resolution. The camera showed Ember walking into the pastor's office, her demeanor agitated, her body language tense. Pastor Brooks, on the other hand, remained calm and composed, attempting to talk to her but maintaining a respectful distance. There was no hint of the behavior Ember had described. As the video played, a hush fell over the courtroom. The prosecution's case had relied heavily on Ember's testimony, but the footage called into question the veracity of her account. The defense team could see the shift in the room as the jury's attention was drawn to the undeniable truth on the screen. Pastor Brooks sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the footage, his mind racing with the implications of what was happening. This was his moment. The evidence was clear. It was his best chance at clearing his name and reclaiming the respect he had lost. Ember, who had been sitting quietly in the witness box, now looked visibly uncomfortable. The once confident young woman who had seemed so sure of her accusations was now facing a harsh reality. The video was not something she could deny. It contradicted her entire story. As the footage ended, the room was filled with an eerie silence. Ember's emotional testimony now seemed hollow in the face of the undeniable evidence that Pastor Brooks had not committed the crime she had accused him of. In the days that followed, the courtroom drama continued to unfold. Ember's defense team tried to counter the evidence, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss the footage. The prosecution focused on trying to discredit the video, suggesting that it was taken out of context or that the footage had been altered in some way. However, there was no solid evidence to back up their claims, and the jury remained skeptical of their arguments. Meanwhile, Pastor Brooks and his defense team remained calm, trusting in the truth of the video. They knew that this was a pivotal moment, one that could either exonerate the pastor or further complicate the case. As the trial continued, more witnesses were called to the stand. The pastor's character was examined in great detail, with several church members offering testimony about his behavior, his integrity, and his relationship with the congregation. Many spoke of his kindness, his commitment to helping others, and his unwavering faith. These testimonials painted a picture of a man who had devoted his life to serving others, someone who was trusted by the community, and someone who had never exhibited any signs of inappropriate behavior. The prosecution, however, continued to focus on the details of Ember's testimony, attempting to paint Pastor Brooks as someone who had used his position of power for manipulation. But the defense remained resolute. They knew that the truth was on their side and the evidence would soon speak for itself. Throughout the trial, Pastor Brooks remained stoic, his emotions tightly controlled. His mind often wandered to the church and the congregation that had been torn apart by the accusations. He knew that the healing process even after the trial was over, would take time. Trust had been shattered, and it would take years for the church to rebuild. But for now, he focused on the task at hand, clearing his name and allowing the truth to come to light. The final day of the trial arrived, and both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution, despite the mounting evidence in favor of Pastor Brooks, tried one last time to sway the jury, insisting that Ember's pain and trauma should not be dismissed. The defense, on the other hand, emphasized the clear evidence from the security footage and the testimony of the witnesses who had spoken to Pastor Brooks's character. Michael Carter, Pastor Brooks's lawyer, urged the jury to look beyond the emotion and focus on the facts. The truth was evident, he argued, and it was time for justice to be served. As the jury deliberated, Pastor Brooks sat in the courtroom surrounded by his lawyer and his supporters. His heart raced as he waited for the verdict. The days of uncertainty, of fear and doubt had taken their toll on him. But he knew that this was a moment of reckoning, and the truth would ultimately set him free. The jury returned after what seemed like an eternity. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood and announced the verdict, not guilty. The weight that had been pressing on Pastor Brooks's shoulders for so long was suddenly lifted. The courtroom erupted in whispers, some with relief, others with disbelief. Ember sat quietly, her face pale, as the reality of the outcome settled in. She had failed to convince the jury, and the truth had been laid bare. Pastor Brooks breathed a deep sigh of relief. His prayers had been answered. The truth had triumphed, and he had been exonerated. But even as the court proceedings came to a close, the work of healing was just beginning. Pastor Brooks knew that the road ahead would be long, filled with challenges, as he worked to rebuild trust and restore the sense of peace that had once defined his church. But for now, the most important thing was that the truth had prevailed. Did you know that in many legal systems, the use of video evidence has become one of the most powerful tools for exonerating individuals wrongly accused of crimes? The aftermath of the trial left Pastor Jonathan Brooks in a state of cautious relief. The jury's verdict had cleared his name, but the journey to restoring his reputation was far from over. His community, once filled with admiration and trust, had been torn apart by the accusations. The church, a place where people had come to find solace and spiritual guidance, now felt like a battlefield, scarred by the events that had unfolded. Pastor Brooks knew that his work was only just beginning. The verdict was a triumph of justice, but the real challenge lay in rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. The first few weeks after the trial were quiet. Pastor Brooks took time away from the pulpit, stepping back to reflect on the events that had transpired. He spent long hours in prayer, asking for guidance and wisdom as he navigated the road ahead. He knew that the healing process would not be quick. Trust once broken was not easily restored. The whispers of doubt still lingered among some members of the congregation, and there were those who would never fully believe in his innocence, no matter how much evidence was presented. But for Pastor Brooks, the truth was enough. He had faith that, in time, the community would come to see him for who he truly was, and the love and support he had given would return to him tenfold. In the weeks following the trial, Ember left town. Her life, too, had been forever changed by the events that had unfolded. While Pastor Brooks had been exonerated, Ember's life had taken a different turn. She had tried to gain attention with her accusations, but in the end, the truth had come to light, and it was she who had been left to face the consequences of her actions. The community had no sympathy for her. They saw her as a troubled young woman who had sought to manipulate the situation for her own gain. She had tarnished her reputation beyond repair, and the isolation she faced was a painful reminder of the choices she had made. For Pastor Brooks, the first step in rebuilding, his life and ministry was reconnecting with the people who had been affected by the scandal. He reached out to members of the congregation, meeting with them individually, listening to their concerns and offering his heartfelt apologies. He acknowledged the pain and confusion that had been caused by the allegations, and he took responsibility for any way he might have contributed to the breakdown of trust. His humility and openness were powerful. Many people had doubts, but seeing their pastor stand before them, admitting the strain and strain on everyone, helped to mend some of the fractures. But not all wounds could be healed with words alone. As time went on, Pastor Brooks realized that he needed to show his congregation that he was worthy of their trust once more. He needed to demonstrate through his actions that he was the same man they had once followed with pride. He began to devote even more time to serving his community. He volunteered at local shelters, organized charity events, and worked tirelessly to support those in need. Through these efforts, Pastor Brooks slowly began to rebuild the connection with his congregation. It wasn't immediate, and there were moments of frustration and doubt. But over time, the people began to see the sincerity of his efforts. He wasn't just a man who had been cleared of accusations. He was a man who had learned from his mistakes, a man who was committed to making things right. One of the most significant steps in the process of healing was the day he returned to the pulpit. The first sermon he delivered after the trial was not one of celebration or vindication. Instead, he spoke of redemption. He acknowledged the pain that the church had endured and expressed his deep sorrow for the division that had been caused. He spoke of the importance of forgiveness, not just for others, but for oneself. He shared his own struggles and fears, showing his congregation that he was not perfect, but that he was dedicated to walking a path of integrity and faith. The response was mixed, but there was a sense of hope in the air. Many people had come to see Pastor Brooks as a human being, someone who had experienced great trials, but who had remained steadfast in his faith. It was this vulnerability, this honesty, that began to bring people back. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere in the church began to change. The tension that had once filled the pews slowly dissipated, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and community. Pastor Brooks continued to lead with humility and grace, and over time, more and more people returned to the services. The church, though scarred, was beginning to heal. It was a slow process, but every small step forward was a victory. Pastor Brooks never took his redemption for granted. He knew that some wounds would take longer to heal, and he continued to work tirelessly to prove that he was worthy of the trust and love of his congregation. The community, too, began to heal. The scandal had left deep scars, but those who had remained loyal to Pastor Brooks found a renewed sense of purpose in their faith. They rallied around their pastor, offering support, prayers, and words of encouragement. They knew that the road to recovery would be long, but they were willing to walk it with him. As for those who had turned away, Pastor Brooks respected their decisions, understanding that trust could not be rushed. He had learned the importance of patience, and he knew that, in time, the seeds of reconciliation would take root. In the years that followed, the church grew stronger than ever. The scandal, though painful, had ultimately strengthened the bonds of the congregation. People who had once been strangers now stood together, united in their faith and in their belief in the power of forgiveness. Pastor Brooks continued to lead with humility, knowing that the journey to regaining trust was never truly over. There would always be challenges, but he was committed to walking the path with integrity, no matter what. As time passed, Pastor Brooks's reputation was fully restored. His ministry flourished, and his community once again saw him as a man of faith, a man of honor. The painful chapter of his life became a distant memory, replaced by a future filled with hope and renewal. The church had been tested, but it had emerged stronger and more united than before. For Pastor Brooks, the journey had been difficult, but it had ultimately brought him closer to the people he had devoted his life to serving. He had learned the true meaning of grace, and in the end, it was that grace that had restored the trust he had once feared lost forever.